I'm actually not comfortable with the myth terminology because usually you see myth and fact, and when people are talking about these kind of controversial issues, all of the concerns about soy have some basis in the literature, right? It could be an animal study, it could be a case. There's a report in 2008, case report describing a single individual, 60 years old. He developed gynecomastia, which is sort of small amount of breast tissue in men. That was legitimate, but he was consuming 12 cups of soy milk per day. That report formed much of the basis for an article in Men's Health that was published in 2009. It's entitled, "Is This the Most Dangerous Food for Men?" talking about soy.
Welcome to Influence to Death, your guide for navigating the wild world of wellness influencing.
Hi, and welcome to Influence to Death. I am Victoria Lafont.
I'm Hannah Wright, and today we have a surprise guest on the podcast. We're so excited to have Dr. Mark Messina here.
Yeah, and so, Mark, we were going to read your bio and to let people kind of know who you are, and then I would love for you to keep telling us your story. We can also put that in after. Would you rather us just put that in after?
Yeah, I think bios are pretty boring.
Okay.
Okay.
We can also just stick in the show.
I just assume if you're talking to someone, there's a reason why you invited them. So everybody's got an interesting background probably on your show. So, but
ultimately, we were reading your research, and I was like, God, I wish we could talk to you in real life. And so I just happened to take a chance and go on LinkedIn, and then you wrote us back, which was so great. So that's it. Yeah. So here's kind of the bottom line is. It's Dr. Mark Messina, but he's asked us to call him Mark, so we're going to do our best to respect that. But he is an expert on all things soy. So from the part one of our Soy Now, what will be a series, we mentioned, there are like thousands and thousands and thousands of research studies on soy, and we did the best we could, but we did not get to read all of those studies. So, but all of that information, and I think probably more, is in your head, Mark.
Yeah.
So I guess let's just start talking about soy, like wherever you think we should start.
Yeah, well, thanks for inviting me. And probably at one time or another, it was in my head, but after a while you lose some and you gain some new information. But I've been in the field since 1989, and I got into the field in I think a very interesting way. I had been a vegetarian beginning in 1972, and the reason for that was because my martial art instructor told me that if I gave up meat, my martial arts would improve, which is completely ridiculous. But I was like 19, so I said, sure, I'll give up meat. So I was vegetarian, had my first tofu in that year, 1972, and I had commented during a recent presentation that that was the first year I saw the Rolling Stones. And 52 years later, I'm still eating tofu, and I saw the Rolling Stones twice in Chicago this year. So
that's so cool.
Awesome.
But I was working for the National Cancer Institute in Washington, and there was a presentation that they had for the National Cancer Institute heard about the role that soybeans may have in reducing breast cancer risk. So he wrote the branch I was working in and asked if we were doing anything with soy. The secretary of the branch saw that note and she said, well, you eat tofu, why don't you do something? And so that actually launched my career.
That's so cool.
Yeah.
Oh, cool. That's
amazing. Yeah, that's a fantastic story. And does your martial arts, did you ever tell your teacher, like, hey, I'm now like an expert in this and you're the person who...
It was many years later, so no, I just let it go. But yeah, and so I started, my interest in soy began with the role that it may have in preventing and even treating cancer, specifically breast cancer. And then after I read more about the topic, I thought that perhaps soy could do more than help to reduce breast cancer risk, might have a role in promoting bone health, heart health, alleviating hot flashes, improving skin health. So I just decided after a few years to devote all of my time to that topic.
Amazing.
So cool.
Amazing. Yeah. That's, I think more and more, Hannah, I don't know if I've even talked to you about this. I hope we have guests on and present research on topics that pertain to breast cancer. Like we want to do an episode on mammography, we actually touched on breast cancer in an episode we did in the past, just because it happened that one of the influencers that is very, very popular influencer, the medical medium, one of his closest followers died of breast cancer. And a lot of people believe it was like kind of under his watch. So you speaking to that, and that's kind of part of how you got pulled into researching soy. There's a tie-in with our podcast, I guess, and part of what we want to feature here.
Well, that's good.
Yeah.
The connection with soy and breast cancer is an interesting one, because most of the initial work focused on the role that it might have in reducing risk of developing breast cancer. That was based on some animal research, some mechanistic studies, and then, of course, the low historical rates of breast cancer in countries that consume soy. But
Right.
that kind of ecological observation is maybe grounds for further research, but nothing that you would want to base a conclusion on, because the issue isn't whether Japan has a lower rate of breast cancer than the US, it's whether women in Japan who eat soy have a lower rate of breast cancer than women who Japan who infrequently consume soy. And when you look at that question, the answer is they do have a lower rate if they consume soy. But my personal opinion, and one that I've held since really 1996, is that for soy to reduce breast cancer risk, you need to consume it during childhood and or adolescence. It looks like these plant estrogens. It's probably not the correct terminology, but these isoflavones in soy change the cells in the developing breast in a way that makes them less likely to develop or to be transformed into cancer cells later on in life. It still may be that adult intake is protective, but I think you get the most bang for your buck if you consume it when really between the ages of 5 to probably 15. That's what the data would say. But what's interesting is that then there became this huge controversy, and it still exists, although to a lesser extent, about what impact soy has on the prognosis of women with breast cancer, both breast cancer whose growth is stimulated by estrogen as well as estrogen receptor negative breast cancer. So that's been a controversy because of some animal studies that began to be published in the 1990s suggesting that these isoflavones in soy would stimulate the growth of existing mammary or breast tumors. And it wasn't for another decade, in 2009, that observational studies showed the exact opposite. So in that year, the Shanghai Breast Cancer Survival Study was published, and that tracked 5,000 women with breast cancer. They looked at dietary intake 4 times over a 4-year period, and they found women who consumed the most soy actually had lower risk of recurrence and improved survival. So the consensus about soy and breast cancer, or at least with respect to women who have breast cancer, began to change. It actually did a 180. And now if you look at recommendations from the American Cancer Society and the American Institute for Cancer Research, as well as a bunch of others, they not only suggest or actually conclude that women with breast cancer can safely consume soy, but also suggest that it may actually improve their survival. So
prognosis.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay, I already have like 10,000 questions I want to ask. That's a good sign for me to. Hannah, is there anything that comes up for you that you want to ask?
Oh man, yes. Okay. The one thing I'm thinking about is, since you listened to our last episode on soy, thank you, by the way, I'm honored that you took the time to listen to that.
I sped it up though. I always do that.
Fair enough. I do that too. I always do that. So something I learned in our research is the microbiome influence on how soy affects estrogen and its metabolites. And so I'm thinking about that, what you just said about women or girls eating soy regularly, and how that later influences breast cancer risk. And that's just like incredible. I had no idea. And now my brain's going, well, is that because of their gut microbiome? Like, would that be a part in that? Or could that be the case for anybody any young girl who consumes soy, or do they need those right microbes to have that effect?
That's a really good point. I'm glad you brought it up. I mean, first of all, I used to mention quite frequently during my presentations that early pregnancy also is markedly protective against breast cancer. So you had the choice of becoming pregnant when you were 15 or eating tofu. To me, you do the math and it's eating tofu. So this notion that the microbiota influence whether or how you react to soy was actually proposed by Ken Setchell, who is the true pioneer in this field. He got me
we
into
saw
the
his name.
field, so he's been in it longer than I have, and he's still working very actively in the field. I talk to him quite often. This was proposed in 2002 that those individuals who host a certain bacteria and are able to convert one of the isoflavones in soy called daidzein into
Thank you for the
acrol. That's
pronunciation.
right,
We needed that.
daidzein. There you go. Who are able to make that conversion are more likely to benefit from soy consumption. That's a very interesting hypothesis that, again, has been around now for 22 years. It's intriguing, but we don't have the clinical evidence to really support it at this point.
Okay.
And
Interesting.
of the 3 isoflavones in soybeans, genistein is present in the highest concentration, and that appears to be the isoflavone with the most biological activity. So if you just give genistein without the other isoflavones, you see some pretty pronounced benefits, but oftentimes the data are inconsistent and conflicting. And some of that has to do with the fact that people metabolize isoflavones differently. And also just in general with diet and nutrition studies, sample size is really small because first of all, compliance becomes an issue if you're actually intervening with foods, and then the money isn't available for diet studies like it is for drug studies. So when you have small sample sizes, you're more likely to get sort of conflicting or inconsistent results. And that's why you meta-analyze the data. You take a bunch of small studies and analyze them for the purpose of integrating the findings.
Okay.
I'm really glad you spoke to that because there's so many directions this can go. But as far as like research interpretation and kind of understanding like the benefits and the I guess maybe the pros and cons would be a better way to say it, of interpreting research. It's good for people to understand, like, part of the reason that and please correct me if I'm wrong about this, part of the reason that we get so much information about nutrition science from these large scale population studies is because are they a little bit less expensive to run versus a clinical trial? You can see patterns. You don't have to worry about the people eating the food, like you said, like what's the right word?
Adherence to the protocol.
Yeah, the adherence to the protocol.
So each type of study has its own strengths and limitations. So if you wanted to look at the role of, for example, soy in breast cancer prevention, how would you do that study? If you enrolled, adult women, you would have to follow them unless they were at extremely high risk, which is one way to do the study. You do have to follow them for decades, because even if you took 50,000 women and enrolled them into a study and gave half of them soy and half of them a control food, it would be decades before you'd have enough numbers to actually do a meaningful comparison. So the observational studies will enroll 50,000 individuals. They're not feeding them anything. They're just recording what they're consuming. And then they can follow them for 10 or 15 or even 20, 30 years. And so you can actually look at cancer, but it's difficult for people to recall what they've consumed. There's, there's always the issue, if you're eating tofu in Iowa, are you also meditating and running marathons? So these are confounding variables. So that's why, you hear the phrase all the time, the totality of the evidence. And that's what you need to look at. You have to look at the clinical data, the intervention studies, and the observational studies. In terms of observational studies, the prospective studies are the ones that carry the most weight. These in this case, they follow usually healthy individuals for many years, record the diet, and then see how outcomes differ according to dietary intake.
And are they the strongest, you think, because there's just so many people that they're following?
In the hierarchy of evidence, the prospective observational studies are below the randomized controlled trials, but you can't do randomized controlled trials for cancer in most instances.
Right.
So, for example, in the case of soy consumption by women with breast cancer, no studies have actually have enrolled one group of breast cancer patients, given them soy, and another group given them a control protein, could be cow's milk, whatever it is, and then looked at recurrence and survival, because that also would just take many, many years. It'd be very, very expensive, and you'd run into the problem of compliance. So in this case, you can look at markers of breast cancer risk, like LDL cholesterol, and blood pressure are markers of heart disease. There are markers for cancer risk. So you can measure the density of the breast using mammography, a mammogram, or you can actually take a biopsy of the breast and look at how quickly cells are replicating, because cells that replicate more quickly have less time to repair DNA damage, so they're more likely to be transformed into cancer cells. So there have been 20 studies or so that have looked at the impact of soy or the isoflavones on these markers of breast cancer risk in healthy women, women at risk, increased risk of breast cancer, and women with this disease, and they've shown no adverse effects at all.
It's one of the biggest, I think, myths that we came up against based on how we initially were taught nutrition, is that, soy caused cancers and feminization in babies. I mean, there were kind of all these myths that we were taught, which is part of the reason we wanted to do this episode, is because we know a lot of people have that bias.
If you don't mind, I'm actually in some ways not comfortable with the myth terminology, because usually you see myth and fact, and when people are talking about these kind of controversial issues, all of the concerns about soy have some basis in the literature, right? It could be an animal study, it could be a case report. So, for example, for male feminization, that's one I focus a lot on, because both professionally and I eat a lot of soy, so it matters to me. And I'm trying to maintain my muscle mass as I age. There was a report in 2008, case report describing a single individual, 60 years old. He developed gynecomastia, which is sort of a small amount of breast tissue in men. So that was legitimate, but he was consuming 12 cups of soy milk per day, 360 milligrams of isoflavones, which is about 10 times Japanese intake. And that report formed much of the basis for an article in Men's Health that was published in 2009. It's entitled, "Is This the Most Dangerous Food for Men?" talking about soy. So that really helped fuel this concern about male feminization. Interestingly, in 2015, they acknowledged that they had made a mistake in their interpretation of literature. And in 2019, they again apologized and had an article entitled, Is Tofu the New King of Protein? So if you actually look at the data, I was involved with the statistical analysis of 41 randomized control trials. So again, the highest type of evidence. And we looked at, involving almost 2,000 men, we looked at whether isoflavones or the soy foods impacted testosterone levels and estrogen levels. No effect on either. And you have to look at estrogen levels, because older men actually make more estrogen than older women do. And there was no hormonal effects, no effects on sperm or semen parameters, no effects on gynecomastia in the actual clinical trials. And interestingly, and these again are case reports, so it's not a strong form of evidence, but in 2006, there was a case report describing a man who had low sperm concentration, and after 6 months of consuming isoflavones on a daily basis, his sperm count normalized, and he and his wife were actually able to have a child. So, but that was in 2000. So it's the opposite of what you would hear. That was in 2006. Now, 18 years later, this year, there was almost an identical case report, same amount of isoflavones, normalization of sperm count. So.
Yeah, I remember coming across that when we were researching, seeing studies showing that with sperm morphology and health, and I was like, oh, this is really cool, because you just hear the opposite all the time, that it could be detrimental for that, and this is showing that it could be helpful.
Yeah, it's interesting, because it's the same thing with the breast cancer prognosis situation. But again, the concern was based on animal studies, a legitimate model. But it's a mouse model, and the mice have their ovaries removed, so they stop producing estrogen. They have their immune system inactivated, so they can implant the cancer cells into the animals without being rejected. And usually, animal studies are done before human studies. You often cite animal studies as a justification for conducting clinical trials, because trials are very expensive. And it was a long time. It was about 10 years, as I mentioned before, until the evidence started to suggest not only the soy was safe, but potentially beneficial.
Yeah.
Okay. And so I just want to make sure I understand, like, like with the word myth or like that, the reason that that feels like problematic for you is because like there is some like grain of truth, but then would you kind of explain that a little bit? I think
It's
that's
just my
important.
personal feeling, because to me, myth sounds like it's completely made up, and that the
Yeah.
people that would suggest this is the case are almost, purposely misleading, disinformation,
Mhm.
and
Mhm.
that's just not the case. And also conceptually, you think of estrogen as, right, the female reproductive hormone, and soy contains compounds that are commonly classified as phytoestrogen. So
Hmm.
it's, conceptually, it's easy to think, well, why would I want to consume soy if it contains these plant estrogens? But the
Mhm.
plant estrogens in soy are very different from the hormone estrogen. And in fact, there was just a paper published 2 days ago that looked at 4 endpoints that are affected by the hormone estrogen. So this is in postmenopausal women, a statistical analysis of a bunch of studies. And the isoflavones in soy had no effect on any of these outcomes that are affected by the hormone estrogen. So they're very different molecules. And in the
Hmm.
end, you can sort of hypothesize, speculate based on sort of mechanistic understandings all you want, but you really need to look at the clinical data. Because,
Yeah.
for
Mhm.
example, so we've known about the estrogen receptor, now called estrogen receptor alpha, for decades. But in 1996, a second estrogen receptor was discovered, estrogen receptor beta. Isoflavones like that one much more than estrogen receptor alpha, the first one, whereas estrogen likes each of those equally. So there's a
Hmm.
molecular basis for differentiating isoflavones from estrogen. But that receptor wasn't identified until 1996, and it wasn't for 2 more years that it was shown that isoflavones bind to these receptors differently. And these two receptors have different tissue distributions within the body. And generally speaking, when you activate the newly discovered one, estrogen receptor beta, it has an anti-proliferative effect. Whereas activating
Mm.
estrogen receptor alpha, the first one, has a proliferative effect. And generally speaking, you don't want proliferative effects in adults because, again, the faster cells replicate, the more likely they are to be transformed into cancer cells.
Yeah.
Awesome. Just so
Yeah. I think that's really with the myth idea too, like how you said, okay, yeah, like it's not true. It was based on something real, and then it takes time, like 10 years, 20 years to be like, wait a minute, that's not right. But in that time span, people are taking that and running with it, and then I
It,
feel like that's where you get this kind of misinformed idea.
yeah, it's clickbait,
Right.
and
Yeah,
bad,
exactly.
bad news gets more eyeballs than probably good news.
Yeah.
So, but again, I don't like to judge why someone might be talking about something. I just try to look at the science and see how that shakes
Yeah.
out.
we need you to come back on maybe a couple times, Mark, and remind us of that. But it's a point that comes up a lot in our every episode where it's like every idea there is truth there. Like there is a
Mhm.
grain of truth there, but people who aren't, scientifically literate or they're just busy with their lives trying to, like make the best decisions for themselves.
And
They don't know that maybe it's been like, ballooned out into an idea
yeah,
that is it's
also,
extreme.
sorry for talking over you there.
You
Also,
go.
there's so much research published on most
Yeah.
topics, and if you
Mhm.
cherry pick the data, you can come up with really convincing arguments for
Yeah.
anything that you want for pretty much any diet or any food. And if you're a consumer, and even if you're a health professional but not focused on a particular area, if you see a video and some person is citing ad nauseum, study after study after study,
Mhm.
and at the end they've
Mhm.
cited 20 studies, you don't know, there could be 500 studies that contradict those 20.
Right.
And
Yep.
it's the same thing
Right.
in books. When you read, books targeting the consumer, they seem impressive because they're heavily referenced, but people just don't know they don't know the research that is not being cited.
Mhm. It's what's coming to mind is actually right now in a completely different realm of nutrition science, seed oils and vegetable oil consumption. There's this huge controversy in the integrative world between
Mhm.
people saying, people with huge names, people saying veggie oils are great. I'm sorry I told you that they were detrimental. The science shows that they're really healthful, and then other people saying no, they're rancid and toxic. It's like this huge back and forth right
Mhm.
now. And so like so many of kind of the the meta of what you're talking about, like looking at what actually happens in humans versus the mechanistic studies and the animal studies, it's like all of the base of that seems really important for that discussion also. Like it's applicable for anything that we're looking at in nutrition.
Yes,
Mhm.
so you could maybe tell I was smiling because that's an area that I spend a lot of time
Okay,
on.
cool. We'd
Actu-
love to hear what you think of
Yeah, I have a pretty decent working knowledge in the area, and I actually usually in my presentations I'll touch upon seed oils because soybean oil is the
Mhm.
major seed oil consumed in this country. It's phenomenal, actually. It provides 7% of our caloric intake, which is a huge amount for
Wow.
one food. And there are over just a trivia. There are over 500,000 soybean farmers in the U.S.
That's my family, Mark.
Oh, seriously? Oh,
Yeah.
fantastic.
Yeah. That's my family.
And your family was from where?
So like right now I'm in Paducah, Kentucky, but the farm is just right over the Ohio River on the Illinois side. So Brookport, Illinois is the little town, but the whole like bottom land over there and even some up into like Golconda and southern Illinois essentially is
Yeah,
where the farm
Illinois,
is.
Iowa, Indiana, big
Yeah.
soybean growing states. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So, okay, do you want to talk about seed oils a little bit? I know that's not why you're here, but if you want to dive into that,
Yeah,
we will.
it's up to you. I mean,
Oh,
I'm
please.
happy to do so.
I
You
mean,
know,
Hannah, is that okay with you?
Yeah, I mean, soybean oil is a big topic because that's one that a lot of people say avoid soybean oil, and it kind of is different than the aversion to soy protein. It's like the oil, it's a different category in some people's minds, and so yeah, I would love to hear
well,
that.
it should be a different category. I mean, they're different entities,
Mhm.
right? So most of the soybeans grown in the world are used for animal feed. The
Okay.
vast majority, 90+%. And so in this country, the soybeans can be crushed and the protein, it's a very high quality protein is used for animal feed. And the protein is separated from the oil basically. And after some refining, you end up with a lot of soybean oil. So it's available, it's relatively inexpensive. And so it's used in a lot of products. So one of
Mhm.
the issues is that soybean oil can often be found in products that are not very nutrient dense, really nutrient
Mm,
poor. And some people
mhm,
conflate the harmful effects of foods with the soybean oil, containing soybean oil, as opposed to the soybean oil itself. Um,
mhm.
the concern about seed oils is based on a couple of things. One is they're actually a relatively modern addition to the diet. They really started to
Mhm.
increase in the 1960s. And so the predominant fatty acid in most seed oils is linoleic acid. It's a polyunsaturated fatty acid, and it's an essential fatty acid. And our intake of linoleic acid has increased dramatically because of the increased intake of these seed oils or vegetable oils. So that's a good reason to consider what impact linoleic has and these seed
Mhm.
oils have on our health. But I'll be darned if I have a very difficult time finding evidence to suggest they're harmful. Everything tends to go in the opposite direction. The more
Mhm.
linoleic acid you consume and the higher levels in your blood or in your red blood cells, those higher levels are uh, consistent with reduced risk of diabetes, coronary heart disease.
Mhm.
It's just difficult to see any kind of adverse effect from the population data and from the clinical trials because the seed oils lower LDL cholesterol levels.
Mhm.
The concern has been that linoleic acid, I don't want to get too technical, is converted to another fatty acid in the body. It's also an omega-6 fatty acid. And from
Mhm.
this, after this conversion, that there are some metabolites produced from this fatty acid that are pro-inflammatory. But what we know
Mhm.
now is that the control of this one fatty acid is very tightly regulated. So you can consume a lot of linoleic acid, more than you would actually want to, and levels in your body, in your tissues of this fatty acid really are unchanged. Furthermore, some of the metabolites of this fatty acid are actually anti-inflammatory, not just pro-inflammatory.
Mhm.
That's that has really been debunked. And there was also this concern about an high omega-6 to omega-3 fatty acid ratio that
Right.
probably you're familiar with. I know when I went to school literally decades ago, you wanted to have a very low ratio, and it was thought that like maybe Paleolithic man had a dietary ratio of 2 to 1 or even 1 to 1, and now our ratio of omega-6 to omega-3 is probably pretty close to 10 to 1. So, but if you look at health authorities really around the world, they no longer value or consider that ratio as an informative metric. It's not predictive of health. And the real focus now is on making sure you consume enough of both omega-6 and omega-3 fatty acids.
Okay, so the question that comes up for me is like kind of back to this, like, where's the seed of truth? Like, were there some mechanistic studies, or was there something that maybe led people to believe that?
Yeah, Again, it's not made out of nothing.
Right.
The inflammation part. Well, first of all, you had this idea that if you wanted to eat like Paleolithic man or women, maybe I should say also, you would have a low ratio, and our ratio has skyrocketed. In 1909 in the US, our ratio was probably 5 to 1. Now it's 10 to 1. So you say, well, is that, that's sort of a strange a new development, certainly. So we need to look at this. And then there was this issue that linoleic acid, that primary omega-6 fatty acid in seed oil, it has pro-inflammatory effects. And it was really based on in an incomplete mechanistic understanding of what was happening internally. That's why it's so important to not focus on mechanistic studies. If you find a clinical effect, then you go back and say, well, how is this actually happening? And if you discover a determinate mechanism, that adds credibility to the clinical observation. But everything should start with what actually happens when you eat this food or this particular product. So, for example, there's a lot of concern about processing because, and people, I get why this issue resonates with consumers. In fact, so when you think of soybean oil, now soybeans are actually what people don't recognize. Most beans are almost fat-free on a caloric basis. They're like, 5%, 3% fat, except for chickpeas. Soybeans are about 40% fat. So you get a lot of oil from soybeans. But it's often pointed out when you think of an ear of corn, you don't really think of that as a source of oil. So it takes a lot of ears of corn to produce a tablespoon of oil. So that's another concern that has been raised. And then the processing involved to go from the ear of corn or the soybean to the soy oil or corn oil is a concern. And I just look, what matters is what happens when you consume soybean oil and when you consume corn oil. And from the literature, it's beneficial. I mean, these observational studies, clinical studies are all supportive of benefit.
Yeah, we had a guest on, Mark, who that was her stance also. But then, there's like this other kind of very well-known name who's saying like, no, this is not the case. But it is interesting
Are the
to
initials
see, like,
TG?
I don't think
PS?
it's Dr. Shanahan, Dr. K. Shanahan.
Okay.
Yeah.
The Hateful Eight.
Yeah.
The Hateful Eight. Yep.
Yeah.
That's
also the title of a movie, by the way. So I think she might be sued
she
for
worked
that.
it out somewhere. A little Netflix influence. That's kind of the tradition that Hannah and I came out of, is the one that Dr. Shanahan is speaking to. And so, I mean, I can feel in myself that I have a bias. I'm like, I cannot buy a bottle of canola oil to cook with. It's so hard for me to like get past that. But it's a great conversation to have, where it's like, okay, well, why do people believe what they believe? Is it because it's based on what the literature shows or people's actual experiences, or it's because they've been told something over and over, and it's created this bias?
It's really a phenomenon. I mean, I've been in the field, in the nutrition field a long time, as my wife. She's also in the field. And I'm not sure I've seen anything that has caught on as much as the concern about seed oils, because it's pretty much just internet based. And I've given hundreds of presentations to dietitians. And often when I bring up a topic, I'm sort of disappointed at how unaware of the dietitians are about it. Now, it's usually because when I'm involved in an area, I think it's the most important thing in the world, and everybody should be spending their entire life devoted to this topic. But when I ask about seed oils, almost the entire audience raises their hand. So it's really a big issue.
Interesting. Yeah. Gosh. Okay.
Instagram and TikTok, I feel like, have taken that to next level for sure. Social media. I'm curious if you, based on your, vast knowledge of the research, is there anyone who should maybe not eat soy foods?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Well, like all protein foods, they can cause allergies, right? And so
Right.
are that about 3 out of every 1,000 adults are allergic to soy protein. And if you're allergic to soy protein, you can't consume soy foods. You can consume soy sauce, and you can consume highly refined soybean oil, and most likely lecithin, which is in a lot of foods, but you actually can't consume soy foods. I actually was just writing. I'm writing a manuscript. I'm writing a lot of manuscripts. That's what I do. And I just literally this morning wrote a statement that it was hard to identify evidence suggesting harmful effects of soy or isoflavones in adults. So there was a concern, for example, about soy and thyroid function. I don't know if that's come across your desk, and that topic has been researched for almost 100 years. The first animal study was published in 1933. And then in later animal studies in the early 2000s, it was shown that the isoflavones in soy inhibit the activity of an enzyme involved in the synthesis of thyroid hormone. But again, these are in animals. So then you go to 2019 and you look at a statistical analysis of 18 randomized controlled trials, no effects of isoflavones on soy on T3 or T4 levels, the two main thyroid hormones. There was a concern that if you had subclinical hypothyroidism, which is in between like overt hypothyroidism where you need medication and normal thyroid function, if you were in between that there was a study published in 2011 suggesting that maybe soy might cause you to progress from subclinical to overt, the worst condition where you would need medication. But then a follow-up study was conducted with a larger sample size and even a larger dose of isoflavones, and that was not repeated. Now, soy foods, like all foods, can inhibit the absorption of thyroid medication, thyroid hormone that people take. Recommendations are to consume that medication in a fasting subject, right, in the morning. So if you are going to consume soy foods, I would probably wait at least 1 hour and possibly 2 hours before. Now, if you want to consume soy milk in the morning or, with cereal or whatever, and you really want to consume soy foods every morning, you can just, through with your health care provider, just up the dose of medication. And then you titrate it anyway, according to blood level. But all sorts of food in general inhibits the absorption of medication. I'm not sure soy is actually any different in that regard. Fiber supplements, even iron can inhibit the absorption.
You're right.
So in terms of effects, there's for obvious reasons, there's a lot less data in children because it's, can you imagine how difficult it is to do a clinical trial in adults, let alone in children. But the organization for which I work, Soy Nutrition Institute Global, is actually funding a couple of studies in children. One's looking at the effect on cognitive function, and the other one is looking at whether soy foods reduce the amount of liver fat. Fatty liver is a huge epidemic in this country.
Yes.
You used to see it only in adults. Now you're seeing it in 10-year-old kids. And the problem with that is that you end up, it's the same thing with diabetes. If you develop diabetes when you're 65, you only have to worry about the complications of the disease for, maybe 15, 20 years. If you get it when you're 15, you have like 60 years that this could cause problems. So it's not, I don't think that there's any particular food or diet that is especially efficacious at weight loss. I mean, that's difficult.
Sure.
Maintaining, weight loss chronically is just extremely difficult. That's why the GLP-1 receptor agonists are so intriguing. Yeah. But if you can't actually reduce body weight, if you can still reduce the amount of fat in your liver, that would be very advantageous. So we won't know that for a couple of years, but it's a very fascinating study.
Yeah. And do you have any evidence that suggests, like we saw with using soy-based baby formula that there were higher levels of the isoflavones
Oh, they're huge.
in infants.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Is there anything showing that?
that was shown in 1997 by, again, Ken Sutcliffe, one of the pioneers in the field. It was published in the journal Lancet, really high quality journal. They're huge because if you're not consuming soy formula, the levels are basically zero, and that's actually parenthetically why I got into the field, because I became interested in isoflavones and their role in perhaps cancer prevention. And the only way to get isoflavones into your diet from foods is to consume soy foods. That truly makes soy unique. So average isoflavone intake in Japan is, roughly speaking, about 40 milligrams per day. In the US, it's no more than probably 2 milligrams per day. And that's true. So in populations in Asia, you see isoflavone intake is high. In non-Asian populations, except for vegetarians, it's, the diets are almost devoid of isoflavones. So if you're consuming soy formula, you're getting a lot of isoflavones. It's not clear they're having a biological effect. It's harder to study that issue, but I think one of the best studies is conducted at the University of Arkansas, and they've been publishing results for the past 5 years or 6 years now, maybe. And they have a group of women who are breastfed, a group that fed their children soy formula, and then a group that fed cow's milk formula, and they're not finding any adverse effects whatsoever. But again, it's a much harder issue to study. I would have no problem recommend if someone was the pediatric associations recommend cow's milk, and if you're allergic to cow's milk, because about 14% of the kids will also be allergic to soy milk, they recommend going right to hydrolyzed formula, which is non-allergenic, but it's more expensive, and it does, the taste is an issue. I have no problem, suggesting to someone, if they are allergic to cow's milk, or if they think cow's milk is harmful, they're vegans, have ethical objections to it, to absolutely, use soy formula.
Yeah. It is very expensive. I mean, that's a huge barrier for those types of allergen-free formulas. I mean, it's enormous. Like like a lot of money,
For sure.
to feed your baby. Yeah.
I'm trying to think, Mark, I'm just sort of enthralled generally at your depth of nutrition knowledge. So I'm curious, one, is there anything else you feel like you want to communicate about soy? But then two, is there just anything, period, in nutrition science that's caught your eye that you think is interesting that you want to share?
Well, let me do this. Well, thanks for your kind words, by the way. But it's just a matter of how old I am more than anything else. I've been reading stuff for a long time. So there was a couple of myths, and I think you certainly touched upon the organization that spread the initial myths about soy, and they talked about Asians only consuming fermented soy foods. That's something that you hear, and that's categorically incorrect, because Chinese consume very little in the way of fermented soy. I mean, oftentimes the dietary questionnaires in populations that are involving Chinese ethnicities don't even include questions about fermented soy foods, because their primary soy foods are soy milk and tofu, which are both not fermented. So that's not true. In Japan, it's about 50% fermented, miso usually, and natto to a lesser degree, and 50% unfermented, mostly tofu. In Korea, it's about 70% unfermented. So most of the soy consumed in the world is unfermented. The other issue that they said, and I think you mentioned about maybe consuming a tablespoon of soy only.
2 teaspoons.
Yeah, 2 teaspoons, less than a tablespoon.
That's not true, is it?
I actually know where that, think about it. Have you ever been, gosh,
I know.
if I know where that came from, I believe. There was a study, not a study, just a paper published in 1995, where it mentioned that average soy protein intake was 8 grams per day. So a tablespoon is 14 grams, right?
Yeah.
So they mistook the 8 grams of protein for 8 grams of total soy foods. And from that, they said it was like less than a tablespoon of soy. But 8 grams of protein are found in a cup of soy
Cup of
milk
soybean. Yeah.
or basically half a cup of tofu. So that's
Mhm.
really where that came from.
Ah,
Amazing.
In
yeah,
terms of
that's helpful.
in terms of my recommendation, well, you didn't ask me that, but I'll give you my intake recommendation.
Awesome. Yes, a
Yes,
takeaway.
yes.
We love a takeaway.
Yeah, if you look at population studies, what you see is that generally speaking, the consumption of about 1.5 to 2 servings per day is associated with benefits. So if you're going to see in studies that show soy intake is associated with a lower risk of heart disease, diabetes, certain cancers, and not all of them show that, but in the studies that do show those kind of beneficial effects, the highest intake group is generally about 1.5 to 2 servings per day. In Shanghai, it's a little higher than that because they eat a lot of soy in Shanghai. So what they do in these studies is they compare the risk of developing a particular disease, and they'll have either quartiles or quintiles of intake, sometimes tertiles. So they'll compare the group that eats the lowest amount of soy to the group that eats a middle amount of soy to the highest amount of soy. And the highest amount of soy is usually associated with the most benefit, and that's 1.5 to 2 servings. In the clinical studies, they typically don't intervene with soy foods, like sometimes soy milk, but almost never tofu for a couple of reasons. First, if it was a 6-month study and you're recruiting non-Asians, you would worry about compliance. Can people consume 2 servings of tofu per day every day for 6 months? You get a lot of dropouts in all likelihood. The other thing is that ideally the subjects and the researchers are blinded. So the researchers don't know which participant is in which group, and the participants themselves don't know if they're in the placebo or the sort of active, or in this case, the soy group. Because if they know which group they're in, they may change their diet for one reason or another. And if you're eating tofu, it's pretty hard to not know you're eating it. I mean, you can make tofu from other beans and they're on the market. So that might be one way to go. But most of the time, the intervention products are either soy protein that contains isoflavones, and sometimes you can compare soy protein with isoflavones versus soy protein without, versus something like casein, which is the primary protein in cow's milk. So a lot of studies are done like that, or you actually can use the isoflavone supplement. Now, soy foods are more than isoflavones. Like all foods, they have lots and lots of biologically active agents. They contain linolenic acid and omega-3 fatty acids. Some soy foods contain fiber. They're great sources, for the most part, of high-quality protein. So if you like isoflavones and you're thinking about how to get them in your diet, you really want to start with soy foods, not only because of all the other components, but because hopefully you're displacing less healthy foods from the diet when you're consuming soy, so you're getting a double benefit. So I usually recommend like 2 servings per day as the goal, but 1 is better than none. 2 is better than 1, and 1 is better than none. And also, by the way, soy protein does have an FDA-approved health claim for its ability to directly lower blood cholesterol levels. So that's a direct effect of the protein, not because soy foods tend to be high in polyunsaturated fat, but as David Jenkins and colleagues showed back in 2010, it's sort of a dual benefit, because you get the benefit of the protein for reducing cholesterol levels, and then you also get the benefit of polyunsaturated fat if you're replacing animal sources that tend to be high in saturated fat.
That's
Amazing.
cool.
Yeah.
So
Good
what
news. I love it. So happy to hear it.
Me too. How do you incorporate soy into your daily diet? Like, if you mind sharing that.
No, it's not a big secret, and my wife would be better to answer that. She's a dietitian, vegetarian, vegan expert, and she ends up doing the cooking in the house. I'm a better eater than I am a cook. The cooking is very relaxing for her, although she, I think sometimes she gets tired of cooking so much because I tend to eat a lot, but for me, I look at like return on investment, and this is, like when I cut the lawn, I love to cut the lawn. I've been cutting lawn since I was like 10 years old. You cut the lawn, and for like 4 days, it looks awesome. And it only takes like me 2 hours. You cook, and it takes so long, and then it's gone. Then you have to clean up. It's just like, wow, the math doesn't work for me. But we have tofu. I mean, my wife literally consumes tofu at least twice a day. She has a fantastic diet. green leafy vegetables, it's perfect. You could take a photo of that, put it in a nutrition textbook. So I use soy milk, tempeh, and tofu. Those are my three main soy foods.
Nice. Those are my
I
favorites.
actually noticed that on social media I follow some vegan or really plant-based influencers, and there are some amazing recipes that people are posting now, like using silken tofu to make puddings and mousses, and there's great resources out there.
Yeah, it's but people still want more recipes. That's another problem I have. It's like there's so many cookbooks out, and yet they still sell really well. So, the goal is to just identify like a couple of soy foods that you like and try to incorporate them in your daily diet. So everybody, I guess there's exceptions, loves edamame. I mean, I have a lot of personal experience with that. They're regular. You can actually have edamame soybeans, but for the most part, they're just soybeans harvested at 80% maturity. So they retain the moisture and they have a higher sugar content. So they're a little bit sweeter. And, they're great on salads. Kids love to pop them into their mouth.
Yeah.
So that's another
My son
one.
loves them.
Yeah, and then even something like soy nuts, because, they're higher in fat, they're crunchy, they're usually salted. Now, the thing about soy nuts, and I like soy nuts, but I eat a lot of just mixed nuts, tree nuts. And so I wouldn't want I would much prefer that someone eat tree nuts and, edamame and soy products. But if you don't, if that's the only product you can consume, then I think it's important to get some soy into your diet.
I've actually gotten those at the airport before when I'm stranded. The soy nuts, I've seen them. Yeah, they're good.
And they even have dried edamame now. So that's another convenient way to incorporate it into the diet.
Something I love about incorporating tofu is that it's a very affordable source of protein, like at least at the grocery stores near me. And even organic, non-GMO tofu is very affordable for the quantity that you can get. And
100% agree with you. And if you go to some Asian stores, which we used to do, they actually make tofu themselves, and it's even less expensive. But when you look at the per pound price, tofu is an excellent deal.
Yeah. Mark, okay, any other nutrition pearls that have been piquing your interest lately?
Yeah, just the GLP-1 receptor agonists, because I think these drugs are revolutionary, because it's so darn difficult to maintain weight loss. It's difficult to lose it, but it's, as we all know, it's extremely difficult to maintain that weight loss. Some people can do it, but very, very, very few. Your body's just not designed, or let me say the opposite way. Your body's designed to regain that weight, because you kick in the starvation reaction, and it becomes extremely difficult. So obesity has a health cost, and some people look at obesity as a moral failure. I don't look at it like that. I think it's like any other chronic disease. I think I've evolved. My thinking has evolved on this topic, and I get that there are potential side effects with these drugs, but I think they will be reduced, and the cost eventually, and probably sooner than later, will not be a factor because it's already coming down. So I think the issue here is that if you're on a GLP-1 receptor agonist, and there are also combination drugs as well that target other hormones, you are consuming fewer calories, which means your diet has to be more nutrient dense. So I really think if you get a prescription for these drugs, you should also get a prescription to see a dietitian. Because you really need 100%. To focus on your diet. And hopefully, if you consume a healthier diet while you're on these drugs, if you do discontinue them, you will maintain that healthful diet.
Yeah, awesome. Yes. I'm going to try and lay this out. It's a little bit cyclical in my brain, but it's like there have been what I would consider maybe misunderstandings or miscommunications around metabolism for so long, like people being very, very married to carbohydrates lead to diabetes, or the insulin model of diabetes. And it's I think part of the reason that I'm so passionate about trying to find the full picture of our understanding is because it's when we have that limited view of sugar causes metabolic dysfunction, or I'll just stick with that as the example, then it's hard to accept the massive benefit of something like a GLP-1 agonist drug, because if we look at the full picture, then it's like we understand like the major effect of obesity on metabolic dysfunction. It's like a bigger picture allows us to address health issues in a more comprehensive way, and it gets lost.
Yeah. Well, nuance isn't very popular these days. And
No,
most
that's what we're trying to
most
bring back, Mark.
yeah,
We're trying to
yeah,
bring nuance
good
back.
luck. Good luck with that one. After you do the science, work on the politics one. The other thing with the GLP-1 receptor agonists is the concern that you're going to lose muscle mass, and also
Right.
both, especially muscle mass, because that occurs with any weight loss, and it's not clear that
Mhm.
I don't actually think the evidence suggests you lose more muscle per, kilogram of body weight that you lose. I just think it's a fact of weight loss. So you do
Right.
want to engage in resistance exercise training, which is just so important for all people. I'm just huge on resistance exercise training. The amount of muscle mass that you lose beginning at the age of about 40 is disgusting. I mean, it's so annoying. I mean, and you actually lose more strength than muscle mass. So
Right.
by the time you get to 75, if you haven't done resistance exercise training, I mean, you've lost at least 30% of your muscle mass and probably more than that strength. That's bad metabolically. It's bad for, quality of life. So you really need to engage in resistance exercise training. And it's possible that additional protein beyond the RDA may help in that regard. One other thing, if you don't mind, is the topic of ultra processed foods.
Yes.
Okay, wait, let's put a pin in that real quick. I just want to like point out two things to people. One, you made a point that I think is, I don't know, maybe I'm just bringing it up because it's a pet peeve of mine and I want to like straighten it out. People associate hypertrophy, which is growth of muscle, with strength. And those are two separate things. It's like you can go to any gym, well, maybe not any gym, but I've seen this a lot. And there are like really small people picking up enormous amounts of weight. They don't have huge, bulky muscles. So just to kind of like key in to people that you mentioned that like having big muscles definitely is associated somewhat with being strong, but being strong does not necessarily connect with having huge muscles. But for quality of life, having muscle mass on the body is like the metabolic,
So
risk of injury decreases. All these things are really important, and that decreases along with strength. And you're saying maybe even like strength more than muscle size as we get older.
That's another annoying thing. When I would go to the gym and see people with skinny arms lifting more than me,
I hear you, Mark. Totally understand.
because and one interesting observation with the GLP-1 receptor agonist is that it's possible that the quality of the muscle actually improves. So what's left is better quality, and that's an active area of investigation now. So a lot to be learned.
And I think the second thing I was going to say that's so important is like people I think don't realize when they lose weight, they just see the pounds on the scale, but the composition is changing in such a way that they're not just losing fat, they are also losing that precious muscle mass. And so I think this is important to point out that you said this, that we don't have good evidence showing that a GLP-1 agonist increases muscle mass loss more than weight loss without a GLP-1 agonist. Is that right?
That's correct.
Okay, that's important. It's a really important point to bring up that I don't think people are considering.
Yeah, and the fear is that, and this is outside my area of expertise, so I never go. I don't like to go outside my lane, but the fear is the yo-yo effect. That if you go on the drugs, your body composition is going to change. If you go off the drugs, you're going to gain a whole lot of fat and probably less muscle. And if you do that repeatedly at the end of several years of doing that, you may end up with a lot worse of a body composition than you started out with. So I just can't stress enough resistance exercise training. I mean, that's really the key.
Yeah. I'm married to a meathead trainer, Mark, so we're really into
That's great.
I see meathead in the most loving way.
Yeah.
Okay, so and then you were going to talk about this other
one last. Oh yes.
Yes.
So that is really a hot topic in the nutrition world. It's some countries have incorporated this concept into their dietary guidelines. The World Health Organization has sort of embraced this concept of ultra processed foods. The current Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee in the U.S. was actually charged with addressing a question about ultra-processed foods, and they just announced that there's just really not enough data at this point for them to address it. And so they'll probably in the next iteration, that'll be a bigger topic. But I have a little bit of, not a little bit, of an annoyance with this whole system. So just very quickly, it's the NOVA food classification system. It was started in 2009 by Brazilian researchers, and they divide all foods into one of four groups, essentially based on the extent to which they have been processed. And the reason that I've become involved with that area of research is because, believe it or not, soy milk, some types of tofu, and all soy burgers are classified as ultra-processed foods, which puts them into the same category as Twinkies. And in short, we don't have enough time to go into the whole system, but in short, I think that the system is clearly insufficiently nuanced, paints with too broad of a brush to serve as a public guide for food purchasing decision. Because to consider, so yogurt is, unflavored yogurt is in group one, the foods that you would want to encourage according to this system, whereas flavored yogurt is in group four. Again, flavored yogurt is going to be quite healthful, much more than most of the other foods in the ultra-processed food category. Unfortunately, and you see some politicians now talking about ultra-processed foods and some people with influence talking about that. I don't really think they understand the system. I think what's happened is ultra-processed foods has become a synonym for junk foods. And that's fine. But we've already known that foods that are nutrient poor, that too high in sugar, low in fiber, are not good for you. So I really don't know how this system helps. And I think it actually hurts, because if it discourages someone, so take an example, I'm not being very articulate here, I apologize, but take as an example a fruit smoothie. So if you combine fruit and milk and make it into cow's milk and make it into a fruit smoothie, and then that's a group one food, because fruit and milk are group one foods. If you then add a concentrated source of protein to it, could be whey, could be pea, could be soy, it becomes a group four food. Now, I think every nutritionist in the sun would say the smoothie with the protein is a better choice than one without it. And so I just think this system, in some ways,
that's so flawed.
Yeah.
I wasn't aware of that.
In some ways, I think it does more harm than good.
Yeah, I would say so. We should have an episode about that.
Yeah, Mark, do you want to come back?
That's important.
You should have an episode, in my opinion, but there are plenty of people I can recommend. That would be wonderful guests, and I'll happily listen to it.
Well, you are more than welcome to come back anytime you want to come back. But we talk about that in sports nutrition, which is the field that I'm more heavily involved in, because whey protein is so wonderful in so many ways, like even in like gastrointestinal health, right? It's like we see it addressing inappropriate intestinal permeability, increases glutathione levels because of the amino acid balance, and then muscle protein synthesis, like you're talking about as you age. But I believe it's classified as ultra processed, right? Just whey.
If you can't make it in your kitchen on your own, it's going to be ultra processed. That's really So it's just ridiculous. I would say in terms of, whey is a really high quality protein. It's high in the amino acid leucine, which is one of the branch chain amino acids that trigger muscle protein synthesis. But I will say that, and I'm stealing this analogy, but I've also added to it that the one person that I listen to in this area more than any other, great researcher, very prolific, does a lot of social media, really good speaker. He looks at resistance exercise training as the cake and the amount of protein you consume as the icing on the cake. So the key is resistance exercise training. And in fact, some of the recent papers suggest it's just about how much total protein you consume rather than the type of protein that you consume. And most people would say you probably need to double the RDA, so it'd be like 1.6 grams per kilogram rather than 0.8 grams. But the key is resistance exercise training.
Yep, we're with you on that 100%.
Good.
Yeah. Any other questions you can think of?
I mean, I have like 100, but I know time is about up. So
you can email me that. I'll be happy to answer. No, I
Mark,
enjoyed
thank you
my
so
time
much.
here. Thanks
Yes,
for
Yeah.
inviting
thank
me.
you.
We've really, really appreciate it. And also, I'm guessing my family is going to be excited to hear this because they're harvesting soybeans right
now.
this minute.
Well, maybe my family will eat it and they'll start eating seed oils. We'll see.
Oh my gosh.
So they'll
Good
hear it.
luck with
Maybe
that.
they'll eat it. Maybe they'll hear it. Excuse me.
Sweet. Mark, thank you so much.
Okay, thank
Yes,
you.
I hope we
Nice
stay in
meeting you.
touch. Same.